Hello and a very good day to everyone. My name is Diptarup Ghosh Dastidar and I am an assistant professor at the Amity School of Languages, Amity University, Chhattisgarh. And today we are going to discuss the poem Ulysses by Lord Alfred Tennyson. Now before I move on, let me just tell you what we are going to discuss in today's class. Today we are going to discuss the background to the poem, a background to the age in which the poem was written, and a background to the poet himself. So this class would aim to clarify everything that revolves around this poem. So the age, the poet, and the poem itself with its background. So we'll begin with the age in which this poem was written. So the age in which this poem was written, Ulysses, is known as the Victorian Age or the Victorian era. Now, why is this called the Victorian era? I'll just write this down over here. The Victorian era is something that begins around 1838 and it goes on up till 1901. So why 1838 and why 1901? It's simply because in 1838 Queen Victoria ascended the throne of England, and in 1901 she passed away and King Edward came on the throne. And then we have the Edwardian age, and then the modern age comes in, like the modern age of literature. And then you have the modernists coming in 1920s, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound. We'll not go into that. We'll stick to this period, that is 1838 to 1901. And when we think about the Victorian age itself, if there is one literary figure who comes into our mind when it comes to poetry, because when we think about prose, then in this period the biggest name in prose is Charles Dickens. He is a celebrity and he is someone who popularized the idea of reading novels in front of people. But we'll not even talk about prose. We'll talk about poetry. And in poetry, the biggest name is Lord Alfred Tennyson. Now, why? Why is Lord Alfred Tennyson the biggest name in poetry during the Victorian age? We'll discuss that. But before that, a little bit about the age itself. What is happening during this time? What has happened just before this? Just before the Victorian age, you have had the Romantic era of literature. So the Romantic era of literature, in which we get to see people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, who came up with their lyrical ballads, which actually began the Romantic period in 1798. So you see, 1798 is around 40 years back. That's when the Romantic age begins. And then in 1850, William Wordsworth dies. But the Romantic era and its influence died much before that. In 1838, from most of the Victorian era, you have a completely different style of writing coming into focus. And that is because of the society in which the English were living at that time. So what was this society like, and what were the mentality, what was the thought of the people at that time? Let's think about it in this way. What are the things happening during the Victorian era? Number one, you have the Industrial Revolution. At its peak, the Industrial Revolution is something which took England way ahead of all the other countries during that time. So in the Industrial Revolution, it was the rise of the machines, and all the other countries had not seen these machines when England was actually building them. And this took England quite far ahead because they had more things to trade right now. And remember, this is also the time when the British are colonizing India. So they're not just colonizing India, they're colonizing various other places. So there is this scramble for colonies everywhere. The French are going to colonize Africa, and the British come to South Asia and they colonize most of the places in South Asia. So there's this scramble for colonies and there's this scramble for power that is going on all around the world. I want you all to focus on this as well, because all of this is important when it comes to understanding an age. So during this era, that is the Victorian era, the Industrial Revolution is happening, and the Industrial Revolution has taken England way ahead of the other nations. And during the Industrial Revolution, you have a huge difference being made, a huge discrimination being made between rich people and poor people. The rich people have gotten way more rich, and the poor people, they have become way poorer than before. So there's this huge gap when it comes to the financial terms. There's this huge gap, but there is development, and this is what they call the Victorian compromise. I'll just write it down over here so that it is easier for you. I hope that all of you will be able to see whatever is written on the board. So the Victorian compromise is, what is the Victorian compromise? That you are having progress, but even if you are having the progress, a lot of people are at stake. There is a huge line of poverty, and that line of poverty has gone down. It has gone way down than it was in any other era. So there's along with this Victorian compromise, and as a result of this Victorian compromise, you have a general loss of faith, and that comes with science. During this period, you have people like Charles Darwin and so many other scientists who are talking about evolution, who are talking about creation, who are talking about the mysteries of the earth, and they are trying to demystify the way in which the world was thought. So with the advent of science in the Victorian era, with the advent of industries in the Victorian era, man is starting to trust machines. Man is starting to trust his mind. Man has just stopped believing in God. And so there is this loss of faith, which you can see, which you can find in a lot of Victorian poetry. You talk about Matthew Arnold. Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold is an amazing example where you can see the loss of faith. This loss of faith is also something which comes in various other poems of Tennyson, of Browning, and this loss of faith can be seen in various novels at that time as well, and very subtly, but yes, you can find that. Now, we have gotten to understand a little bit about the Victorian era itself. So during this period, 1838 to 1901, where Queen Victoria was ruling, you had the Industrial Revolution, that is a boom in the machines, and along with it, you had the rise of science, and therefore the Victorian compromise, in which there was progress, but also at the cost of a lot of people. And with this, there was a loss of faith, which is again a part of the compromise that was happening. So these were tumultuous times. These were times when a lot of problems were arising in the society itself, and the society was broken down in a lot of ways. I mean, when you speak about the humanitarian nature of the society, then that is quite at stake over here. Now, let's get into the poet, and how the poet is related to the time, and how the poet is related to the person who is ruling at that time, that is Queen Victoria. I'll just erase a few things from the board so that it is easier for you all to understand what comes next. I hope that the age was pretty much clear. Going on, in the Victorian era, you have Queen Victoria ruling, and there is this strange connection between Queen Victoria and our dear old Lord Alfred Tennyson, who was born in 1809 and who died in 1892. So you can see that Lord Alfred Tennyson pretty much, you cannot expect a person to write right from the birth, right? You cannot just be born and start writing. You can't do that. So you have to be at least a few, maybe 20 or 30 years of age. So by 1830s, when he starts writing, I'll talk about all that. In 1830s, when he starts writing, up till 1892, Lord Alfred Tennyson, and one of the reasons why his name pops up whenever you talk about the Victorian era, is because he lived the Victorian age. His entire life was the Victorian age, and he has contributed a lot to that. Now, while talking about the Romantic age, I told you guys that in 1850, William Wordsworth passed away. Now, see, William Wordsworth was the poet laureate of England. When he passed away, that post got vacated, and well, there were some issues. Some people denied it, and it was Lord Alfred Tennyson who was given the post of the poet laureate of England from 1850, and he held the post of the poet laureate all the way up till 1892. So that's a huge 42 years as poet laureate, and that is the biggest, that is the longest period that someone has stayed the poet laureate. Lord Alfred Tennyson, kudos to you. So now, moving on. From 1809 to 1892, Lord Alfred Tennyson lived. What did he do? What were the poems? When did his poetic adventures begin? So the first poem that he wrote was in 1829. It was a poem called Timbuktu. Now this poem Timbuktu, he just wrote it and he just gave it in a competition, and this poem won him the competition, and it was a college competition, and it won him the competition, and therefore this is also called the prize poem, because this won him a prize and people came to know more about Tennyson because of this poem. So with 1829 Timbuktu, his poetic adventures begin, and in 1833 he writes the poem Ulysses, but he does not publish it. Now, see, whenever we write poems, you do not publish it just the year in which you wrote it. Maybe you collect a few more poems and then you decide of publishing the poems. And that's what Tennyson did. Tennyson published Ulysses in his second volume of poems, which is titled Poems. 1842. So Poems 1842 was the volume in which you will find Ulysses as a poem, and it's a small poem, and we'll discuss more about the poem in the next video. In this video, I just want to talk about the background of it, right? So in 1829 you had Timbuktu. In 1833 you had Ulysses. In 1850 he became the poet laureate, and he stayed the poet laureate all the way till he died. Well, much later he wrote a poem, and this is known to be his masterpiece, In Memoriam. So I'll just write it down over here. In Memoriam. See, In Memoriam, the poem, this was written as an, he was extremely saddened by the demise of his very close friend. I'll just erase parts of the board so that I can write more. Maybe I'll erase, I don't know, this part. Yes. So yeah, In Memoriam was written in memory of his friend Arthur Henry Hallam. So you will often find the writings, the inscriptions of AHH among a lot of his poems, where those poems are all dedicated to Sir Arthur Henry Hallam. Now, Arthur Henry Hallam, he died at the age of 22 years, so that's not an age to die, right? And he died out of a stroke, and this actually hurt Tennyson a lot. And Tennyson wrote in Memoriam in memory of his friend. Now the fun part is, this poem is what connects Queen Victoria to Tennyson even further, because through this poem what happened is that Queen Victoria started to respect Tennyson even more, because Queen Victoria called Tennyson, and she went to meet him, and when they met, she told him that your poem In Memoriam, it has soothed me in a time when I was completely inconsolable. So when did it soothe her? When her husband passed away. So her husband passes away, and during that time when she read In Memoriam, it gave her a lot of solace, a lot of peace. And therefore, the poet and the queen, they became way closer after that, because they had this interest that bind them together. So once that was done, 1809 to 1892, Timbuktu, 1833, you have the Ulysses in the second volume that comes in 1842, and then we have come to know about Arthur Henry Hallam and it In Memoriam, and the connection between the queen and the poet himself. So I hope that I have been able to clarify the background for the age. I've been able to clarify the background for the poet a little bit, because see, there is no end to knowledge. You can always know more about things, but my job is to make it easy, to make it easy so that you can understand with ease. Now, coming finally to the poem itself, I'll just talk a little bit about the background of the poem, what the poem is about, and we'll probably end our lecture or this particular video session with this. So the poem Ulysses, in this poem, Ulysses, now who is Ulysses, or what is Ulysses in the first place? Ulysses is the name of a classic hero, a classical hero. Tennyson has taken the name for this poem and the entire story of this poem from the Greek myth called Odyssey, and not just Odyssey, Iliad by Homer. So we'll talk about the epics, we'll talk about the background to the poem even further in the next video, but in this video, just let it be known that in this poem, he talks about this king, that is Ulysses, who has become old and decrepit and who just cannot relate with his empire anymore, and he wants to leave his empire and he wants to go on one last journey, because this person Ulysses, he wants to go on a journey, one last journey. He is a man known for journeying. The reason journeying, the word for journeying is Odyssey. Odyssey means voyage, and therefore his name is Odysseus as well. So Ulysses has another name, that is Odysseus, because he loves to journey and he wants to go on this one last journey with his friends. And the poem, in a way, it is very optimistic. It is filled with a sense of optimism in it, and we'll discuss all of that optimism. We'll discuss the entire background. Who is Ulysses? What are these epics? Why did Tennyson take from these epics? What is the structure of the poem? All the answers to all of these questions, we'll have it in the next video. Thank you so much, people. I hope that you've learned something from this video about the age of the time and about the relationship between the people, between Tennyson and the Queen, between Tennyson and the time, and you'll know more in the next video. Till then, take care.